Hi everyone, Bach Photography here, back with another video. Today we're going to be looking at a comparison video between the iPhone 11 Pro Max and the Sony A7R2 and Canon 5D Mark IV, the mirrorless camera and the DSLR camera. So this video, we're going to be looking at a few photos that were taken on all of these different cameras, and then we're going to be looking at the differences in quality, how the iPhone can perform compared to a high-end mirrorless camera along with a high-end DSLR. And just before we get into the video, make sure you go into the description and check out my free ebook on how you can take portraits at nighttime. So if you're interested in learning how to take beautiful portraits in low light at nighttime, go into the description and check out that ebook. And I'm going to leave in the description a link to the photos from this photo shoot. You're going to have the photos from the iPhone 11 Pro Max, the Canon 5D Mark IV and the Sony A7R2, so that you can have a go editing them and see the flexibility in all of these images and which ones perform better in Photoshop. So I'm going to be shooting with the iPhone 11 Pro Max just with the native camera app, and I know that you can actually get apps that then allow you to shoot in RAW, but you can't shoot in RAW if you're using the portrait lens of the phone, and you also can't shoot RAW in the native app. And I think that most people that get this phone for the camera, or just for a phone in general, aren't going to be downloading special apps where they can shoot in RAW. They're just going to be using the native software. So I think it's only a fair test if I use it like that and not with some fancy third-party apps built in. So we're really going to be putting the iPhone 11 Pro Max through its paces because we're going to be shooting into the sun to try to get backlight on Kiara's hair. And shooting into the sun is always the most difficult type of photography for any camera sensor, because you're going to have a lot of light coming into your sensor that's really harsh, and then you're also going to have these shadowy areas that aren't lit up by the sun as well in the same photo. So your sensor is going to have a much harder time exposing correctly for both of those situations, and it's going to require a lot more dynamic range to keep the quality in your sensor for those photos. So this is really where camera phones in general fall apart, but I was actually very impressed with how the iPhone 11 Pro was still able to capture beautiful photos with a backlit portrait. So now we're going to have a look at those three photos you saw at the beginning again, but a little bit slower. And I encourage you to pause when each of these photos comes up and really have a look at it, really study it, and then see for yourself which one you think is the best and which one you think is the worst. And then just after that, I'm going to reveal which camera took which photo, and just pause it before that part and have a guess on which camera you think took each of the photos. So there are a few giveaways, and you can probably tell which one is from the iPhone. And here are the photos lined up together, and you can see which photo came from which camera. So my personal favorite in this photo shoot was the Canon 5D Mark IV, quickly held up by the Sony A7R2, and finally the iPhone coming in last. But I still really think that it is very impressive what results you can get from the iPhone 11. The problem with the iPhone 11 photo, I think, is that because you have way less dynamic range from your tiny 1-inch sensor in the camera, you have way less flexibility with backlighting your subject and shooting into the sun. You can see in this photo here, I've really turned around so I'm not shooting directly into the sun, and yet you can still see quite a lot of flare and creep from the sun coming through from the side. And I'll show you in a minute another photo that I took with the iPhone where I really shot into the sun, and you get such a loss of contrast that essentially that photo becomes unusable. You can see with the Sony A7R2 and the Canon 5D Mark IV that the lighting is much smoother, and I think that's because the iPhone 11 Pro is adding a lot of sharpening to your image because the image is way less big in size, and also the fidelity of the signal to your sensor is going to be much lower, and the quality is just going to be lost because the sensor is simply not as big. Now, before you think I'm saying that the iPhone 11 Pro doesn't take good photos because I put it last on that list, you have to remember that the Sony A7R2 and the Canon 5D Mark IV are the highest level professional cameras before you start paying $50,000 or even more for medium format cameras. And The Sony A7R2 and particularly the Canon 5D Mark IV, which is at the moment the flagship of the Canon line, really are the best of the best when it comes to camera quality, and it's what all the professionals use when they are doing their photography for weddings and things like that. So it's really hard to compare something like an iPhone 11, which is really just a phone camera where the camera is a secondary afterthought, to something like a professional grade DSLR camera or mirrorless camera. So here is some footage I took with the iPhone Pro Max 11. And you can see that the contrast when shooting into the sun gets really, really low, and that's basically because your camera is trying to reduce the contrast of the image coming in so that it can preserve as much quality in the camera, because basically what's happening is when you shoot into the sun, you're getting some really, really harsh highlights, and your camera reduces the contrast to try to compensate for that so that it can get as much good signal as possible without clipping and losing information from those really harsh highlights. But as you can see, the contrast is so low when we shoot directly into the sun that this footage really isn't that useful to use, and the same thing kind of happens when you're shooting photos with backlit light on your portraits. So this phone is going to be really good for taking portraits if you're not shooting directly into the sun, but the quality really goes down when your phone requires to have this really high dynamic range to capture the highlights of the sun as well as the shadows in the scene. So before we jump into Photoshop and have a look at editing one of these photos and then one of the DSLR camera photos, let's just have a look at this photo. And as you can see, the contrast is super, super low when we're shooting into the sun with the iPhone 11 Pro Max. But honestly, I'm actually very impressed with just how well it does maintain reasonable contrast levels that you can bring back in Photoshop, I think. With a little bit of effort, a little bit of dodging and burning and that kind of thing, I think a photo like this could be salvaged and look really, really good. Now here is the photo that I showed you before that was shot with the iPhone 11 Pro Max, and as you can see, it has really nice contrast and you can get a really beautiful photo if you're not shooting into the sun. You get lots of nice detail, and here is the before and the after of this photo with a bit of editing. So now let's jump into Photoshop and edit this photo step by step, and we're also going to edit a DSLR camera photo just so you can see the difference in the editing process and the flexibility that you have in each format. So here's a quick time lapse of me editing the 5D Mark IV photo, and you can see in the beginning we are really quite low contrast in this image because we are still shooting into the sun. So the main thing that you're going to want to do when you're editing from any photo really when shooting into the sun, but particularly with an iPhone 11 photo, is to just try and bring as much contrast back into the photo as you can. Now that's really easy with a image from a Canon 5D Mark IV because of the huge amount of dynamic range that the sensor of this camera has, but basically it's going to be possible on the iPhone as well because the quality of the sensor in the iPhone is actually really, really good. So you're just going to want to go through the camera, through the image, and place bit by bit the contrast back into the image where you think it should be. So into the clothes that are black. Black always really shows when there's a lack of contrast. So just using it like a paintbrush tool in Photoshop or Lightroom, something like that. Also the hair is a big one, as well as eyebrows, nostrils, and eyes, things like that. The parts of the image that are really the focus of the image. So that's everything I did for the Canon 5D Mark IV photo. Really hope you like it. Let me know in the comments what you think. Now let's jump over to the iPhone 11 Pro Max photo as well and see what we can do with the images there. Okay, here we are with the iPhone 11 Pro Max image, and you can see that the contrast is actually higher than the other photo, and that's because we're not shooting directly into the sun like we are with the other photo. So again, we're just going to be doing clarity changes and contrast changes, things like that, just to get the contrast back. You can see here that when we change the exposure slider, everything gets blown out much quicker than it did with the Canon 5D Mark IV images. So we can't make as drastic changes as we can with the DSLR photos, and you can see here that the quality of the camera is not quite as good. You can see that the image looks like it's been sharpened quite dramatically, so any changes that we do make need to be a little bit more subtle, just so they don't look strange in the image. So we're just going to go through the same process again that we did with the other camera, just making parts of the image that we think should be the focus of the image a little bit more bold, so making the eyes more bold, adding a bit more color and clarity to the hair as well to make it stand out, just things like that to make the overall image look better. And even though we weren't shooting into the sun like we did with the other photo, you can still see that the clothes here, particularly Kiara's top, is looking a little bit grey when in reality it was a more black color. And that's just because we're still losing contrast because of the lack of sensor quality that you see in the iPhone compared to a professional DSLR camera. But you have to remember that a DSLR camera is much more expensive, and its sole purpose is only to take photos. So really the iPhone 11 Pro Max here is really performing incredibly well, and I was very surprised just at how well these photos came out. So if you're looking at getting a new phone and you want something with a really good camera, I would definitely recommend the iPhone 11 Pro Max. Now it's a very expensive phone, but I can't really say anything bad about the quality of the photos because they really are very good, especially for a camera phone. But if you're wanting to take professional level photos, I'm not sure camera phones are quite up to the standard yet. You can see here that the lighting on Kiara's face is very flat, and I'm actually just adding a little bit more whites to certain areas of her face here just to make her face more contoured and look a little bit more natural like it would in real life. And all these things that the iPhone Pro Max is lacking, you really can add back in with Photoshop if you have a little bit of skill with Photoshop. So some people don't like to edit their photos too much, but if you don't mind editing your photo a little bit and adding contrast in like I am doing here, adding little changes here and there just to make the image look a little bit better and pop a little bit better, then I would definitely recommend this as a camera phone and as a camera if you're just looking to get into photography. Maybe you just started, you're just looking to practice or something like that, or if you're just looking for something that you can take everywhere and not be over encumbered by a heavy camera. So here is the before and after. Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know what you think. Who won this challenge? Was it the iPhone 11 Pro Max? Was it the Canon 5D Mark IV? Or was it the Sony A7R2? My personal favorite in this one was the Canon 5D Mark IV, but I think the iPhone really performed well and even was a good competitor in certain situations. So if you got to the end, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching. Make sure to check out the raw files in the description if you would like to have a play around with these photos. There's going to be a link to all of the equipment that I used in this photo shoot as well, so make sure to check that out. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.